Marion, if you could, thank you, way ahead of me as usual. Welcome everybody to the Vermont Climate Council Science and Data Subcommittee meeting for August 4th. The agenda for today was posted online, where we will have a welcome and agenda, just go over the agenda. Then the main subject for today is the greenhouse gas inventory review, which has been the initial draft report was sent around by Jane yesterday afternoon. We'd hoped to send it a little earlier. Apologies for that, but David Hill will provide an introduction to that report. We're not going to assume that everybody has read it thoroughly in a day. And then following that and some discussion, we'll have public comment and then updates from task leads for the other tasks that we're moving forward on, and then we'll wrap up. Do folks have a comment on the agenda? Hearing none. I realized that I didn't actually send around the minutes, but they were posted. I'm not sure if subcommittee members had an opportunity to go on the webpage and look for the minutes. If not, we could approve those minutes the next time around. Marion just put a link into the chat. Thank you. And or if there's no objections, we could approve those minutes if you've had a chance to review. So have folks reviewed it, or has anybody reviewed the minutes besides me?
I just did very quickly. I'm happy with either direction. They're short enough that I'm comfortable approving them, but if others want more time, I'm happy to postpone that till the next meeting.
I'm okay with them too.
That's fine.
Okay, well, in that case, let's thank you all. Let's approve the minutes. We'll consider the minutes approved from the July 21st meeting. Leslie Ann, did you want to comment on that?
Yep, hold on.
Okay.
I was just looking at them briefly here. And I should be moved from the additional attendees to the subcommittee members present.
Thank you. I did not catch that. Thank you, Leslie Ann.
No problem.
So with that change, we will make that change and consider the minutes approved. Thank you. Before we dive right into the greenhouse gas inventory presentation, I just want to give kind of a proposed timeline for subcommittee members for this task. And as you all know, there wasn't much time to review in advance of this meeting. So in conversation with Jared and Jane separately, we considered today to essentially be an introduction to the report, opportunity for initial questions and discussion, and hoping that if some committee members have, an opportunity to think about it by the end of the week, to have an opportunity to propose comments and revisions or areas to clarify to Energy Futures Group. Early the following week, either the 9th or the 10th, depending on the quantity of revisions, that we could have those be sent back around to subcommittee members, and then have next week's meeting part of the agenda to have a full discussion and framing of what could hopefully be a consensus recommendation to the full committee. for example, are we recommending the report in full, or are we creating an addendum with recommendations, or if we don't come to consensus, we'll need to figure out the process for articulating a non-consensus position on recommendations. With that, to have, after discussion on next Wednesday, to also allow further opportunity for, if there are any written recommendations that the subcommittee needs, the task group leads could hopefully write those up, and then have a final discussion the following week, which is August 18th. And I just wanted to throw that out there before David introduces the report, just to give folks a sense of, still opportunity to come to think about this over the next several weeks, but at the same time, teeing this up so that we have recommendations for the full council towards at their next meeting towards the end of the month.
If I can just offer a little bit of additional thought on kind of how we arrived at this process, because I imagine, or to recommend this process, because I imagine it could be a little bit of a surprise for folks who looked at the earlier time frame and thought that this may have been completed by now. And I think that because this is such a kind of nuanced, complex topic, I think we all want time to carefully read the full report. I'll just say up front that while I've skimmed the whole thing, I've only closely read the first half of it. So if that's the case for me, I imagine it's the case for others, and also noting that there are going to be interested members of the public who will want to carefully review this, and that it likely will not be available for that purpose until the meeting minutes and documents associated with this meeting get posted. I think that TJ and I believe I speak for Jane, although we talked separately, feeling that elongating this process a little bit to make sure that we get the opportunity for careful review and any kind of questions or comments, not just one chance to do it, but also have a little bit more time this week to provide comments and questions to David and team, and then circle back to this discussion during next week's agenda as well. Not that it would be the sole portion of next week's agenda, but still retain time for that.
Thank you, Jared. That's helpful. Richard.
Yeah, hi. I have a question or comment that is it's about the framing of this report. It's not about the report itself, which I'm looking forward to hearing about. One of the important tasks for the council is to estimate the greenhouse gas benefits of various pathways and strategies that we may decide to follow, and to compare them to each other. And I've been thinking all along that the methods that are used in the greenhouse gas inventory would be the methods that are used in making those estimates of the benefits of various pathways. Okay. I've heard some suggestion that maybe that isn't the case, but I have been working on the assumption that it is the case. And so when I read this document, read the comments about the methods, I think about applying them to that task of assessing the impact of pathways, which is a little different from the intrinsic purpose of the inventory itself, I realize. Any reaction to that?
Yeah, from my perspective, as it relates to the LEAP modeling and that task group, the LEAP modeling is accounting in the same framework as the current climate inventory, and so that initial analysis that the mitigation strategies are going to be based on are being looked at under that framework. And myself, I've only spent not as much time as I'm going to with the report, but well, I guess I don't want to get into that, but I think what they're until we hear the presentation, but we'll hear recommendations I think don't change that fundamental starting point. And I do think it's just it's a starting point for this year, but that's my initial reaction and response to that. So I
Okay,
think
well, thank
we're
you.
aligned.
What I'm imagining, I mean, this may not happen, but this subcommittee could come to consensus that a different value should be used for the global warming potential for one of the sources than was used previously in the inventory. And if we did that, then I would think that that would carry over and would be used in the leak modeling as well.
So yes, I think it depends on what the committee recommends. If if the committee were to recommend base everything on life cycle analysis, then that type of those calculations wouldn't be done in time. If it's something as use a different coefficient for methane, then that is something that could be applied. And so I think it depends.
I mean, the latter should be just changing one cell in the leak model and then looking
Right,
at the change in the output.
Exactly. So I do think that is possible to do that. And
I won't hold you up any further. Thank you.
yeah. Not holding us up at all. It's a good question. Julie, go ahead.
Sure. I just wanted to follow up and maybe clarify one of the things I thought I heard Jared say about public comment on the draft itself. My expectation, understanding, I'm not sure what the right word is that this is very much a public document and obviously welcome the public to take a look at it. Comments would need to be submitted through the public portal, I think, and not through another format that we're going to quickly get to a place where we can't manage the process if we're sort of taking public comment on a draft document as part of our committee meetings and trying to move the process forward. So very much encourage the public that's on the line today to have a look at the report and provide written thoughts that then the committee can consider as we look to make recommendations back to the consultant. Is that consistent, Jared, with what you had intended?
Yeah, 100% agreed. And sorry if I misstated something. I mostly meant that since we will have a public comment portion of this meeting and all future meetings, if there are high level kind of reactions to or questions on this, I think that would be fine. But I totally agree with you, Julie, that if there's specific comment on the draft itself, it would be better to not I agree. It would be challenging from a time perspective and agenda perspective to handle that during this meeting versus receiving it in a written format through the public portal.
Right. Fantastic. Thank you.
Okay. Any other thoughts on the process ahead of actually being introduced to the report? Great. Hearing none, without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to you, David, and take it away.
Thank you, TJ. I apologize. I just got dropped off for a bit, so I missed the last 5 minutes or so of discussion. Partially I'm in a public space here, and I've tried to find the best spot where I can for audio. But let me know if things are not going, if people can't hear me, and I can try to adjust. But I think as long as I stay here, I've got a good connection and can present. So let me share my screen. Is that visible for folks now?
Yep, I can see it.
Yeah. So thank you, everybody, for joining this afternoon. Reminder, Energy Futures Group, EFG, is working as part of the Cadmus team as the technical consultants for the Vermont Climate Council. And one of our key elements, early elements of the scope of work was the task 1 greenhouse gas inventory review, and to develop a report with findings and recommendations on that, and work with the data and science subcommittee and your task leads to review that report, get feedback on that report, and then forward that on to the full Climate Council. So today, presenting on the draft of the report that we completed last week, and what I'll be going through, our scope of work was to review the current inventory that Vermont uses and the methods that are used, and to compare these with both guidelines from the Environmental Protection Agency and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change Guidelines. We've also compared Vermont's current inventory methods with methods and the inventories of Massachusetts, New York, and California. Those were selected in consultation with the task leads for this subcommittee. Part of the report includes a crosswalk table that looks at a number of the different issues and identifies the either good practices. I think sometimes saying best practices in an inventory when the inventories, the inventory guidelines, et cetera, are evolving. I think it's a little difficult to say that there is one best practice. So we preferred to use the term good practices that are in use in other states, and compare and contrast those with Vermont through the crosswalk table, and identify opportunities for modifications and complementary or supplementary analyses with Vermont's inventory looking forward that can help to inform the development of the climate action plan. I apologize that I got dropped off there. I think Richard Hopkins, just as I was losing connection, was asking some questions about the scoping and the use of an inventory in relation to the development of mitigation scenarios and mitigation options. And I think that's a valuable point to discuss, and it's part of what we've addressed in the report. And so there'll be some discussion of that today. Our scope of work also included looking at a consumption-based and upstream inventory methods. And specifically, we were asked to look at work that's been done in both Minnesota and Oregon on consumption-based inventories and how those are used in relation to their inventories, to their greenhouse gas inventories, and any lessons that Vermont might learn from that. And then finally, we have from the open letter to the Vermont Climate Council and from the feedback and discussions that we've had with this group, some issues and opportunities that we list in the report, specific stakeholder comments on ways that people would like to see Vermont consider changing its inventory, modifying its inventory to help with the Vermont Climate Action Plan and activities going forward. The deliverable was a 10 to 15 page report. As you see, you have roughly a 50-page report. So a bit more than that. There may be a version that we condense down just to a summary for the Vermont Climate Council. But I think, as TJ and Jared said, this is it's a rather, there's a lot in the scope that I just went through, and we wanted to give that all its due, be able to discuss these in a way that helps to inform decision-making, provide the background and analysis that we think is helpful. If you condense it too much, you may lose some of that. So we have a bit more of a text in a report with supporting appendices, and appreciate your all reviewing and commenting on that. And I'll go through today the key findings and recommendations based on the analysis that we've done. I would like to recognize Liz Bourget as one of my colleagues at Energy Futures Group, and she has helped significantly. She and I have been the two EFG staff have been working most directly on the greenhouse gas inventory report. I apologize. I know that there's probably some background noise coming through here. Let me know if that gets to be too distracting. but I think this is the best spot that I can speak from. So the methods that we used to conduct that analysis included meeting on several occasions remotely with particularly with Colin Smythe at ANR, who works on the development of the inventory, some follow-up questions to clarify current methodologies and the way in which the different tools are used. The state uses the EPA state inventory tool for much of the work, complemented and supplemented by other the spreadsheets and data sources from the Department of Public Service or VTrans and others. So we did that, and there's a summary table in the appendix that looks at the Vermont current inventory by sector and the different methods, primary data, primary methods that are used. We also needed to do a literature review for the Ipcc and the EPA guidance, and then as well for the states, California, Massachusetts, and New York, that we were going to use as comparative cases for the crosswalk table. We had some discussions with Department of Environmental Conservation staff in Massachusetts who have developed a regional electric sector accounting workbook that does things like settles the REC renewable energy credits at a regional level, and their work on developing that so that the New England region can use a consistent and comprehensive methodology for accounting for the settlement of RECs and their proper disposition in the different inventories, the electric sector inventories for different states. And then finally, the literature review for the consumption-based emissions inventories for Oregon and Minnesota. So those are the main elements that within the past month that we've been working on to help support this work. What I'll go through here today is the introduction again to this work, and then we welcome your more detailed comments and feedback. But based on the task one research and the interactions that we've had with your committee and the other stakeholders, we're offering the following as key findings and recommendations for consideration by ANR and the Vermont Climate Council. So these findings and recommendations that I'm offering today are those primarily of the report authors, which is EFG has led this task, Energy Futures Group, and they don't necessarily reflect the views of the entire members of the consultant team, but they're being presented on behalf of Energy Futures Group for the team. Let me, before I jump into the key findings and recommendations, let me just pause there and see if there are any immediate questions on what I've presented so far. Okay, so I think the first thing that we'd like to really emphasize is that Vermont's current inventory methods are consistent with guidelines from EPA and the Ipcc, and also with the practices of California, New York, and Massachusetts, and then also consistent with the primary inventory methods. When I say primary inventory method, both Oregon and Minnesota use a sector-based inventory methodology as their primary inventory, and the consumption-based emissions inventory is supplemental to that, to help inform decision-making, help to inform consumers, et cetera. So broadly speaking, Vermont's current inventory method follows guidelines and is consistent with the good practices or best practices that are being followed by other states. There's been some discussion in this group on Vermont potentially demonstrating leadership on new inventory methodologies or inventories that go beyond current guidelines and practices. And I think that Vermont can demonstrate leadership, and it's important to demonstrate leadership in the development of the action plan and its implementation based on current inventory method and its methods. So the inventory itself is not the climate action plan, and it's not the analysis of mitigation actions as part of a climate action plan. It's foundational, and it's important that it is, I think, consistent with what is done in other inventories, and that it informs mitigation strategies. But the inventory itself is not meant to be an analysis of the mitigation strategies, nor is it the climate action plan. So Vermont, the third bullet on this key finding point, Vermont's current sector-based inventory method does not represent, and it doesn't claim to represent, life cycle accounting for greenhouse gas emissions. So upstream and life cycle emissions can be analyzed, and the Ipcc, for instance, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, recommends for mitigation strategies that accounting for upstream emissions can be very important to compare and contrast different mitigation strategies. At the same time, they do not recommend that that is the basis for your greenhouse gas inventory. And the reason for this is that the complexities and the boundary issues of full life cycle accounting, and having that be the basis for inventories is it's potentially very, very complex, very difficult, and you still need to draw boundaries on how far upstream, how many different components, et cetera. And so the guidelines that have been developed for inventory accounting take this into account, and they're the result of the best international scientific thinking on how to conduct and keep up-to-date inventories. And so that's the basis for the guidelines that are provided by EPA and the Ipcc. This is not to say, going now to the key findings, page number 2, the top bullet here, is that supplemental approaches and analyses are being used by other jurisdictions, such as the consumption-based inventory in Oregon and in Minnesota. These aren't conducted at the same frequency as the regular inventory, the primary inventory, but they're used to inform and supplement that. We give examples in the report on how that's done and how that can be useful. Another example that I put in here is the short-lived climate pollutant impact report done in California, which develops a specific set of strategies for short-lived climate pollutants, including methane with a shorter time horizon or the ozone depleting substances, and develops mitigation strategies specifically for those, recognizing that they may have greater near-term impacts than is reflected in the official inventory methodology. So California is following an inventory methodology similar to Vermont, where the 100-year global warming potential is used to account for the impacts. It reports on that basis, and at the same time, it has a separate strategy for dealing with and for estimating the impacts of the short-lived climate pollutants. So those are, moving to the second key finding, those are examples of the opportunities that Vermont and other states have to complement their official or primary inventory with supplemental analysis to help inform decision-making, to help inform consumers, and to develop the development of implementation of mitigation policies and actions. The third bullet there, I think I touched on this, the Ipcc, again, not recommending that life cycle or upstream emissions be accounted for in the primary inventories. They do recognize that these are important to account for in terms of mitigation analysis. So if, we provide some examples or discussion of that in the report. Moving along. Understanding and appreciating the basis for stakeholders, members of this subcommittee, the general public, have recommended, well, a full life cycle inventory accounting is important because you want to capture all of the potential impacts that Vermont's actions have on emissions that are happening out of state. Understanding why that's being recommended, I think on a technical and a practical level, the revising and having Vermont revise its inventory to account for that gets us into layers of complexity and the difficulty of accounting for carbon emissions that are exported from the state, from products that have very complicated supply chains and supply chains that are changing all the time, how to keep that up to date, how to keep it accurate, how to keep it consistent with what other states are doing in inventories and those types of things. It is immensely complicated. And so our efforts, I would suggest, Vermont's efforts towards developing mitigation strategies that when and where available, there's good data on upstream emissions impacts, that can be done at a level that doesn't mean it needs to be included in the full inventory. And I understand that in theory, some would like to see it, yes, have the whole inventory be life cycle accounting, but we offer that may not be the best use of collective effort. And then finally, key finding, and I'll stop here before we go to recommendations for any questions. I think public awareness and education on the inventory, the use of the inventory, the fact that the inventory itself is not an analysis of the mitigation strategies. It is not the climate action plan that defines the policies and actions that will be taken to help reduce Vermont's emissions, whether those emissions occur and are counted in our inventory or counted elsewhere. The actions and steps that Vermont is taking to reduce emissions, informing folks about how the inventory relates to that is very important. And education and outreach on all of these subjects at an appropriate level. Thank you. I've gone into a fair amount of detail here. This is an informed subcommittee, but doing that in a way that helps to inform the public at the right level is critically important for inclusivity and for the success of climate action strategies and the maintenance of the inventory and other activities going forward. That's a mouthful, so let me pause and we'll take questions, and I'll let TJ or Jane or someone can moderate the questions.
Right.
After we go through the findings, there are some recommendations based on these.
Great. Thank you, David, for that, the start on the findings. Richard, you had your hand up.
I have two things. As some of you know, I am a recovering public health official. I spent 35 years in fairly senior positions in state health departments and some time at CDC as well. And I spent a certain amount of time defending my agency's data collection activities at the legislature to explain why we wanted to spend money on a cancer registry or a birth defects registry. And, I got very used to explaining how we would use the data to guide policy and guide our program areas and why the data collection was important. So I'm about to come around to the same place that David was, but from a different angle, which is that in general, if you're going to do data collection, it should inform action, either help you decide what actions to take or monitor the effectiveness of the actions that you take. And if you can't do either of those things, then you have to wonder why you're collecting the data and what's the justification for spending public funds on collecting the data. So I have not heard any discussion as part of the Vermont Climate Council's deliberations. Those excellent presentations that were made to the council a week or so ago, suggesting that Vermont was going to institute a program to persuade people to buy less stuff or to buy less energy intensive stuff. That has not been floated as a program area for the Climate Council's recommendations. If there is such a proposal, then it would make sense to measure how much stuff people in Vermont are buying and how much greenhouse gases are produced as a result of those purchases. So anyway, that's my soapbox for the moment. Maybe somebody can articulate a good reason, a good programmatic reason for wanting to monitor greenhouse gases associated with the stuff that we consume. And I could, if that were the case, then of course I might change my position. I have a question for David, just a really simple question, I think. If all 50 states did a sector analysis and added up the greenhouse gases on each state geographically separately, and if all 50 states also did a consumption-based analysis, would the two totals not be approximately the same? And any difference between them should reflect imports and exports in and out of the United States, which are not trivial, but would the two strategies not lead to the same total across all 50 states?
But, well, with the exception of international imports and exports.
Well, that's what I just said, yes.
Well, so international imports and exports would be, if you boundary fenced the US, you could do something that would be accounting for the net import-export emissions of the US. And that is to a degree what Oregon and Minnesota have tried to do at the state level. Yeah. And such methodologies and such an analysis could be useful in Vermont, particularly if, as you were just suggesting, there are programs to help inform consumers about the carbon impacts of their consumption decisions. But for an accounting purpose, for the inventory purpose, and part of your initial comment was the data we're collecting should be used and useful. What Vermont is collecting in its current inventory is extremely useful, valuable, and very important. It's also consistent with what other states are doing. None of these states, and the Ipcc and EPA recognize as well, claim that their inventory method captures the full life cycle impacts of all these things. So that's seen as something where you need to do supplemental or complementary analysis if you want to try to help inform those.
Good.
But I do think that I would not want to give the impression that the inventory methodology that Vermont's following is not very important, used, and will inform the climate action plan significantly.
I think that's what I was saying, David. I was suggesting that I was trying to figure out how the alternative, which would be the consumption-based inventory, would drive policy. And I couldn't see how that would happen. But I completely agree that the current approach is relevant for developing and monitoring the effects of policy.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Sorry, I misunderstood.
My last comment is that across states, whether the consumption-based inventory or the sector-based inventory gives you a higher value or a lower value depends basically on whether the state is an exporter of manufactured goods or agricultural commodities or an importer of such things. It doesn't really reflect, I don't think, differences in consumption patterns, although I don't say that those couldn't also exist.
I guess, yes. And Vermont, we import Vermont's consumption-based emissions inventory. My guess would result in a higher total level of emissions. We import basically carbon-intensive goods and services, more than we export.
And we export agricultural commodities.
Thank you, Richard, for raising those discussion points. Jared, your hand's up.
Thanks, TJ. First, I just want to pause to thank you, David and Liz and the whole team. I mean, this is the amount of research and information that has been compiled in this report is incredibly helpful. And as I think about this and read this report and do my own research, I find that my opinions on some things are evolving. Some have stayed the same, but this is just great information to add to our deliberative process. So first, I just want to pause to thank you for some really great work and the clarity of this presentation. I think I'm hearing a recommendation from you that I don't see explicitly stated in the report. So I want to just test if I'm hearing you correctly, and if I am, pose the question of whether it should be more directly addressed in the report. And that is this. I think the recommendation about the utility of and the availability of supplemental analysis, and that other states are doing that, is right on, is very wise, and I think we should be doing that. Of course, the details of what supplemental analysis that should be matter, and I don't think we need to get into that right now. I also, on the other end of the spectrum, I agree, I recognize and agree with the surfacing of challenges related to a full consumption-based inventory. I think one of the things that I didn't appreciate before enough is just how complex and the potential for inaccuracies based on assumptions and methodologies. I mean, if we think an in-boundary consumption or an in-boundary sector-based inventory is complex, trying to track down the supply chains of internationally and figure out a consumption-based inventory, I would have far less confidence in that it is reflecting the current state of things and giving us, to Richard's point, information that would be actionable for state policymakers. I do think that there is a nice alignment and kind of parallel structure between tracking in-boundary sector-based emissions and the levers that state policymakers have in terms of what is happening in Vermont versus happening in another state or country. But I think that my understanding, and correct me if your research has suggested otherwise, is that most of the complexity and the uncertainty with regard to a consumption-based inventory is around product life cycles, manufactured goods, and complex supply chains. Whereas it feels to me that there is this middle ground, or this in-between question around the possibility to do a upstream analysis, life cycle analysis, well-to-wheel analysis. I think all those terms are fair to use, specifically of our energy use. And that to me feels much more valuable and directly applicable to the council and to policymakers than a full consumption-based inventory. And that it would also need to supplement so that we avoid double counting, and some timescale issues would need to be different than our existing inventory. But I feel like there's a nod to the potential benefit of doing life cycle or upstream analysis of our energy use and energy related emissions, but it's not specifically called out whether or not we should go ahead with it. It feels like there's a section on the inventory and there's a section on consumption-based inventories. I agree the existing inventory follows, a lot of the good practices and recommendations of EPA, Ipcc, other states, and can be supplemented with, different GWP analysis, 20-year for methane, other things like that. And I agree that a full consumption-based inventory is problematic for many reasons. But I'm curious to hear your kind of direct recommendations on that narrower piece of life cycle analysis and upstream emissions analysis, specifically with regard to our energy use, especially because that is, in my reading, is what is specifically called out both in the Global Warming Solutions Act and in the statute governing our greenhouse gas inventory.
That's a good point, Jared. And as we go through the recommendations, I think we were guided by our scope of work, which was to look at those bookends, and basically we are recommending that yes, in the middle there are supplemental analyses that can be very useful. Where are they going to inform policy and strategy designs. Where is data available? Some of the recommendations have been to use the GREET tool, and which is a tool developed by Oregon National Laboratory, and some of the emissions factors that were incorporated into the GREET tool have been provided to the subcommittee, shared by stakeholders. So I think those types of analyses can be informative, and they are, again, they will be supplemental to the greenhouse gas inventory. So I think I'll go through the recommendations as we move through here, but I maybe we can strengthen some of the language that basically says yes, where these can and should be incorporated into the decision-making process.
Thanks, David.
Great. Lou.
Thank you, TJ, and thank you, David, for the presentation so far. I just wanted to echo Jared when it comes to energy with regard to life cycle analysis. And really what occurs to me is that it's a point of practicality rather than of technicality. Given that the greenhouse gas emissions from energy consumption are much more closely associated, or rather controlled by utility decisions. And certainly there are influencing actions on that. But as a point of practicality, it comes down to the state control of what energy is consumed much more easily than what products are consumed. Controlling what comes across state borders, that's interstate commerce, we don't quite have the same control of that in Vermont as we do of what energy we choose to consume. And so I think, in my mind at least, picking and choosing which sectors of the economy to engage in a full life cycle analysis seems appropriate based on, which are practically, which levers we have easiest access to.
And this is not thank you, Lou. I think that's a good comment. And this is not one and done. The climate action plan here is going to be very important. There are steps that, whether you analyze life cycle or you analyze partial life cycle, or, there are steps that we know that need to be taken and developed relatively rapidly across any kind of analytic framework you're putting in place. And that really, I don't want the Climate Council, the public, legislature, regulators, private investments, consumers to get too bogged down in the technical aspects of these inventories, and the accounting are very important. Action is critical. Action is essential. So, distilling all this into something that leads to action on the policy, the investment, the consumption fronts is really critical. We don't want to lose sight of that in trying to accurately reflect all the different ways that you could do accounting and mitigation scenarios. But yeah.
I have just a question, I guess, for Lou and your comment. Were you referring to the electric sector or all sectors, or just the ability to encourage a fuel switch, for lack of a better word, just to use shorthand? I know there's a lot embodied in that term, but it seems like when you use the word control, I think, well, Vermont is a vertically integrated electric industry, and there is some manner of control there for delivered fuels, and including transportation and thermal delivered fuels. There's they're not unregulated in that there are lots of regulations that pertain to them, but there is a lot more consumer choice that is in the equation, I suppose, in terms of what product you use to fuel your vehicle, as opposed to if you're using electricity and you live in a certain spot, you don't have a choice of your service provider.
Right. Yeah. No, exactly. That's a great point, TJ. Thank you. And I really was thinking primarily about electricity. The connection there seems clearest, but I think it holds true for other types of energy delivery, wherein customers can be incentivized, obviously, but once they do switch, then you gain control. So it's a matter of certainly not having that control, but if we're able to gain control, I say that very broadly, obviously, but if it comes under specific regulation because it was incentivized, rather than being incentivized to reduce and remain unregulated or relatively unregulated or uncontrolled, that kind of thing seems important to me, that it comes under control. And that life cycle seems a little more tractable than perhaps all energy. So I guess what I'm saying is that it comes back to the levers. Whichever levers are most easily accessible seem to be the ones worth evaluating, into my mind.
Thanks for that clarification. I think I don't see any more subcommittee hands up, so why don't you continue on to the recommendations, David?
Great. Okay, thank you. So again, recommendations from EFG based on the research that we've done. And the questions that we were directed to undertake under this task one. Some of this we've already discussed. I think that it's helpful that Vermont has kind of a primary inventory that's consistent with international and national guidelines and the practice of other leading states. If the analysis found that Vermont was not consistent with the good practice of other states and it wasn't following guidelines, we wouldn't be coming to this recommendation. But I think it's not to be taken for granted. There's a good amount of work that goes into the inventory. It has, for the purpose of setting targets, say for the Global Warming Solutions Act and others, the inventory goes back in time. And so having an inventory that's consistent, that has set a baseline for the historic years against which you're checking and other things like that, these are all important elements to consider. And so Vermont can maintain the primary inventory that's consistent with and changes if national and international guidelines on these things do change. We should be open to that. But I think we should maintain a primary inventory that's consistent with those, and at the same time contribute to targeted implementation of supplemental analyses that will be useful for Vermont. We wanted to be really clear that we don't think the second recommendation, the development and adoption of a consumption-based inventory, should not replace the primary inventory. So there should be a primary annual inventory consistent with the national and international guidelines. And we should acknowledge the reasons why we're doing that. I think that while we look to develop complementary analyses like other states have done, I think it's also valuable to help inform the public and to acknowledge that Vermont is explicitly trying to be consistent with the scope and the scale of ongoing efforts to have accurate and comprehensive inventory accounting. The intent there is that, if there are upstream oil and gas emissions that are happening in Pennsylvania or the Gulf Coast, or there are hydro impacts from new flooded lands that are happening in Quebec, those are counted in those inventories. That's the guidelines. Those should be counted in those places. Now, Vermont could do analysis that would say we're reducing those emissions, but they don't become part of our inventory. So there's a somewhat subtle distinction there, but helpful to point that out. That ties into this next point on recommendations number 2, is that clarifying and indicating that the inventory is not used for all purposes, but that upstream emissions can be considered without being counted in the inventory may be helpful. In the report, I quote the EPA national inventory. It explicitly, the EPA US national inventory explicitly says it acknowledges that there are other methods for analyzing emissions reductions, and that the inventory itself is not meant to capture all of those. And so, again, informing the public and decision makers about those distinctions may be somewhat subtle, but it's important. The data.
David, do you want, do you want questions on the recommendations as you go, or wait till the end?
If it's okay with everybody, I think that it would probably be best to go through them. I've got a kind of similar set of number of recommendations as we did with findings. If I can get through them, because some of the questions or comments maybe something that's coming in a subsequent point.
Great, thanks.
So I think it'll be more efficient for everybody if we do that.
Okay, thanks. Sorry to interrupt.
Quickly. No, that's okay. I'll move through quickly. Thank you. There have been changes, and there will be changes probably to the recommended inventory methods and guidance. Vermont has changed the transportation method in the last inventory. That was done and is consistent with Ipcc guidance. That type of thing is likely to continue. That will mean that sometimes you'll be adjusting the historic emissions estimates as well. So we should recognize, and another recommendation we make later is that each inventory, well, it's the 4th point on this list, each inventory should contain kind of emerging issues, sector-based issues, opportunities for supplemental analysis, discussion of the data that are available. Those can be incorporated into the inventory. Vermont has not done what's called a key category analysis, and we do recommend adopting a key category analysis. This looks both at trends and the scale for sectors, for categories, and then by greenhouse gas emissions. And that helps to identify the most important emissions sources within an economy and changes that are going on over time. Those aren't, I don't think that those are, given the information that we have in the current inventory, those are not overly burdensome in terms of creating that type of key category analysis. We provide an example that we were able to do during our research of the key category analyses in an appendix. And so we would recommend that be adopted as something going forward. Examples of the types of supplemental analyses that we recommend would be to report on the impacts of taking a shorter term time horizon, say for methane. So New York State reports on its inventory using a 100-year horizon, global warming potential for methane. They also report on what emissions would be if a 20-year horizon was used. That can inform policy and decision-making related to the gas sector, related to fugitive methane emissions, related to anaerobic digestion and those types of things. But the inventory itself still maintains the 100-year global warming potential recommendation. The literature and the tools for life cycle analyses are available. There's a fair amount out there. It's a whole nother, we're not really diving into, here's how we would be doing the life cycle analyses for these in this report or under these tasks. But there are good tools, good estimates, and these can be very helpful to inform decision-making, and they should be developed and used. And upstream emissions estimates can be applied as sensitivities and or as primary analyses to help inform mitigation pathways and without necessarily being part of the formal inventory protocols. The last two, I think that the ANR staff, Colin, does an amazing, excellent job of the inventory. This is not one and done. This is not going away. This is decades. We need to develop and invest at the state level, the human capital and the knowledge base and the quality control and review and all different types of things related to the inventory. So we recommend that making sure that there are sufficient resources and institutional knowledge and the development of training and skills to be able to deal with inventories is very important. And increasing public understanding and familiarity with what an inventory is and how it relates to the climate action plan and the actions that the state are anticipating. It will be very helpful to in the implementation and development process. Let me put things on mute here for a second. So I think that is, why don't we take comments or questions on the recommendation?
Thanks, David. Richard, go ahead.
Thanks. I do want to echo Jared's comment that this is a well done piece of work, and I'm really glad we're having this conversation that is prompted by it. So thank you. I have a couple of comments, and I'll just make one, and then I'll let some other people talk, and then maybe I'll come back a little later. The Global Warming Solutions Act itself, Section 578A, says Vermont shall reduce emissions of greenhouse gases from within the geographical boundaries of the state and those emissions outside the boundaries of the state that are caused by the use of energy in Vermont. So it seems to me that the statute itself directs us to do what somebody else suggested a few moments ago, which is, I think it was Jared actually, that we should look at upstream emissions out of state that are produced by generating energy that we use in our state. And we do that, of course, for electricity. That's obvious that most of the electricity we use in Vermont is generated elsewhere. And we count the emissions related to the generating of that electricity elsewhere. I think that the language of the statute would certainly allow us to apply that to natural gas as well. So that's really, I think I'm supporting what others have said here, but I think that there's a middle ground between an across the board consumption-based inventory and a pure sector-based inventory, and the statute itself tells us what we should do.
Yeah, thank you, Richard. I may be looking for middle ground between the middle ground. I don't know, but I agree that the upstream emissions in terms of mitigation should be counted and considered in terms of our policies and strategies. And the accounting for the electric sector actually does take account of emissions that are happening outside of the state for imported electricity. That is the place that we do that currently. Expanding that to all fossil fuels is another layer that can be very informative and can help to inform, say, the comparison of electrification for thermal use, electrification for the transportation sector. Those are very important. Analyzing those does not, I don't think necessarily that the statute directs the inventory to be counting all of those things in a certain way. It does say that we should be developing climate action plans and mitigation strategies that account for this. I'm not sure if the inventory is necessarily the place that ends up happening. So again, not trying to be too restrictive here, but trying to stay focused on the task of how do we change the inventory to help inform the process.
I have more comments, but I'll hold them for a couple of minutes.
Yeah, I have a point that might clarify some of the complexity or just raise some of the complexity on that. I think I'm just going to go ahead and say it quickly. I know others had their hands up, but just want to point out that we track the emissions from out of state for electricity attributes, right? So if the attributes from a natural gas generator are assigned to a utility, we count that, but we don't count the upstream emissions from that natural gas generator. And so there's just more complexity there than just kind of saying we do it for electric sector and then we should do it for, you know, natural gas or delivered fuels. And I just wanted to make that clear that just with all of this, it's not simple, I guess.
Yep. Thank you, TJ. Yep.
Okay, so Jared, I think you had your hand up next.
Yeah, so I just really want to appreciate the distinction that David made about, you know, I agree with Richard, and I think anybody who has read the GWSA that we need to do a life cycle assessment of our energy use in Vermont, but that should be in as a supplementary analysis to inform policymaking, that it is fundamentally incompatible with an inventory methodology that is looking, you know, within boundaries within a certain time horizon of 1 year, because of course life cycle emissions may happen in multiple places over multiple years. So but that leads me to a question I had on your recommendations, David, which is in terms of being consistent with the statutory guidance on life cycle analysis with regard to our energy use in Vermont. I wonder if you can go back a slide. I think it's the last slide. Yes, so that first bullet point, is it intentional that it says from fossil fuels and hydro, or is it an unintentional oversight? Because as I understand it, it would be more in keeping with statute, and it would be more inclusive and comprehensive if we just said upstream emissions from energy use, because I can imagine that there are other types of energy use that have upstream emissions: renewable natural gas, biodiesel, nuclear, biomass, that would not fall into the categories of fossil fuel and hydro. And so I hope that really means energy use, but if it doesn't, and it really is just fossil fuels and hydro, can you say why?
No, that's a good point. Thank you, Jared, for the clarification. I mean, those are meant to be examples. So it's the GWP modifications for methane is another example. Some folks mentioned, well, shouldn't we be doing shorter GWPs for all the other gases as well? And so those are examples of ones that I think are important. But yes, I mean, with all of this, I keep returning to also within the bounds of analysis and information that can be done now to inform a climate action plan by December, and what can be done on an ongoing basis, can and should be done by multiple parties, you know, participating in these analyses. The perfect analysis will not be done by December, and there is no perfect analysis that's done and then locked in stone. So it's an ongoing process. But yes, thank you. That upstream emissions from energy use is a broader example than what I've put in here.
And then, sorry, just my last question following up on that, and it relates to, I think, the previous slide about kind of, you know, following the latest updates and improvements to inventory methodology, and then making sure that then is applied consistently back through our baseline years. I have a question that I have not been able to figure out, and I wonder if it came up in your research. If not, that's fine, but I just want to flag it for our consideration. Maybe Colin knows if he's on the call, but you know, my understanding is that there is an assessment report 5 out from the Ipcc, AR5, that recommends updated emissions factors for different, greenhouse gases. But that most every state is still using the AR4 values. And I can't tell if that's because most of the inventories have only gone through 2017 and the IPCC would only want that to start in 2019, or if it's just a timing issue. I don't understand why we wouldn't just start using the AR5 as the latest and highest quality values versus the AR4 values.
It's a good question, Jared, and I don't think I've seen a definitive answer. It seems that it's somewhat inertia. The AR5 GWPs are there. We can use those as a sensitivity, but while those have been published, the recommendation is still to use the AR4 GWPs in current inventories. So I don't know whether that's just institutional inertia or some other issue related to timing. But you can, a sensitivity, Colin can talk about this, but I think a sensitivity based on the AR5 global warming potentials would be relatively easy for us to include in an inventory. Colin, do you want to chime in on that?
Thanks, David. Yeah, Jared, I think David pretty much covered it, but my understanding is that although the AR5 values in the report certainly are out there, that the official kind of inventory preparation guidance does not reference that. It says to still use the AR4s. And I think that's why all the states are still doing that at this point. I don't think anybody would have a problem with switching to AR5 once that becomes the kind of official IPCC inventory guidance stance. But I agree with David that doing a sensitivity on it wouldn't be problematic, probably.
Thanks.
Colin, is there just a lag on when the guidance following the publication is updated, or is it, is that being updated?
I don't actually know the answer to that. I know there was a refinement in 2019, but they did not suggest using anything other than the AR4s when that came out. I'm honestly not positive of the release dates when the AR5 report came out, but yeah, I'm assuming it is just kind of a lag time, but there's also a lot of kind of very in-depth science that goes into establishing the different GWP values for all these gases too. And I don't know the details of that, but
Yeah.
could be part of it that they just haven't been totally finalized either, maybe.
Yeah, the latest refinement, as Colin said, was 2019, the IPCC guidance. And so I think AR5 was out at that time, and institutional and or continuing scientific debate about whether the horizons and the GWPs are reflecting the latest science. Maybe they just said stay with AR4 for right now. And if they're, I don't know when the next refinement is expected from IPCC. That might be something we could track down. It was 2006, 2013, and then 2019 is the latest one.
Thank you. Julie, thank you for being patient. Your hand's been up for a while.
My question is actually just sort of building off of the key category analysis, because there is a requirement within the Global Warming Solutions Act that we prioritize the most cost-effective and technologically feasible. Oh wait, maybe this isn't the right one. There's a requirement in there. Oh, that it's the next one. I'm sorry. To provide for greenhouse gas emissions reductions that reflect the relative contribution of each source or category of emissions. And I'm wondering if there's an opportunity to use the key category analysis in support of doing that work. But maybe more importantly, my question is about, so I see that you've got 1990, 2005, and 2018 or 19 as the representative years in that space. And thinking about, the relative contribution and what the right baseline is for doing exactly that sort of evaluation, and if there will be work in the inventory that we can build off of in that regard. Yeah,
I think it'll be informative. I think choosing the years to, there are some examples that the Ipcc guidelines and the refinement from 2019 give of the key category analysis, and we use that as the basis for what we did. I think the determination of what years you're comparing to is discretionary. I mean, you could do it. We have the data to do a full-time series. It would be a lot of numbers and it would be a little overwhelming. So choosing some that were reference points, and we felt that, hold on just a second, sorry. I think those are past now, with some cleaning equipment going by. So the key category analysis also is relatively broad in that the top 95% of your contributing categories are key categories.
Right.
But so there's a relatively small, but it's helpful because if, you know, there are categories in Vermont's inventory that are less, they're in that last 5%. We shouldn't spend most of our time on those.
Yeah.
And that's the type of thing that the key category analysis with trend analysis, and particularly over time, can be very helpful. ODS substitutes were not a key category in 1990. They are now. And so
Right.
we need to have policies and strategies that address those.
Yeah, no, that's very helpful. And I like the idea of using it to narrow the playing field maybe a bit. And I guess just would appreciate any recommendations you have on what the baseline is, right? Because very much that ODS line in particular jumped out at me, and that it was essentially 0 in 1990 and is a very significant source in both the 2005 and 2019 inventories, and sort of how we pick the place we're measuring against, I think is going to be important in terms of this, trying to look at relative contributions of different types of sources.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And I'd recommend that, you know, because we have targets that are related to 1990 and 2005 levels, and then where we are currently, that those are the rational places to start with those. So, yeah, but thank you.
Sorry, I was on mute. Richard, go ahead.
Yeah, I was on mute too. I'm just gonna make a broad comment, and I'm not expecting to have this turn into an extensive discussion, at least not today. But I thought that the state's goals for the out years for 2025, 2030, 2050 were phrased in terms of the results of the greenhouse gas inventory that is called for in statute. That's what I understood to be the case. But we're also saying that, well, for specific purposes, for particular policy decisions, we might do supplemental analyses that use different methods than the methods that are used in the inventory. And we might, those might lead us, might help us in our policy making. And that seems to me to be, I'm confused about that. I'm confused about the idea that we would make some of our policy decisions using different methods, but we would report our progress towards our goals using the same methods as before. That seems off to me. So I'm not bringing this up to hijack this conversation. I just want that to be reflected in the record.
I think it's a very important observation, Richard, and I think that the legislation, the state policies are based on, and the targets were set based on gross emissions, based on an inventory methodology that has been used. And so the task now is, well, do we change the inventory analysis? Or how do we work with the inventory analysis to inform a climate action plan Sorry, there's noise coming here. I'm gonna have to mute again. So I think that Vermont, I think that the Global Warming Solutions Act, the targets are related to an emissions inventory that is a sector-based emissions inventory. And we have targets related to the reduction of gross emissions with that inventory. Under the task 2, the Cadmus team is working on a carbon budget that will help to inform sequestration and land use changes, help to reflect opportunities for different agricultural management and those types of things. So it is a bit, I understand what you're saying, it's a bit confusing, but in a sense, the question of, does that mean we need to develop a new inventory method? And then if we develop a new inventory method, does that retroactively apply to the GWSA targets? Those questions, I don't think, our analysis and looking at, well, the inventory method, it's like, no, you can maintain this inventory method and still develop and actually use the inventory method to develop a strong climate action plan that is based not just what's on the inventory, but some broader considerations, work with the inventory-based targets that have been set, and develop a climate action plan that policymakers, regulators, the Climate Council, and the public can then start taking actions to implement.
Okay, so it's possible that we might take actions based on supplemental analyses using different methods that were brilliantly effective. But that brilliant effectiveness wouldn't be reflected in our inventory, and we wouldn't be shown as making as much progress as we've really made.
I think that gets to education and, again, supplemental analyses and how they're used. If Vermont is reducing emissions in, taking actions that are reducing emissions that are accounted for and show up in other states or other countries' inventories, we can try to acknowledge that. But yes, the actions of Vermont in terms of our mitigation strategies and policies may not all show up just in our inventory analysis. The inventory analysis and our progress still needs to meet the targets by the GWSA.
Thank you for raising that, Richard. That's the point I've been struggling with internally as I look at this as well. It's really relevant, and it, just speaking personally here, it would seem to me that if we use supplemental analyses and we went forward with supplemental analyses, acted on those, and as you said, made great progress on those, but it wasn't showing up, then it may be time to readjust the targets. But I think that would all be a result of, and that would have to happen legislatively, obviously, but that would be a result of that education component that David is talking about. And it would be a big lift and effort, but this whole, addressing climate change is probably a much bigger lift and effort. So I think, but it's a really relevant point. So thank you. Jared, you're next.
Just briefly and by way of illustration in terms of how do we apply some of this analysis and information, my mind has actually gone to the kind of reverse situation, which would be wanting to make sure that we don't pursue strategies and actions that nominally meet our in-boundary sectoral goals, but inadvertently increase emissions elsewhere. The biggest, so take, for example, you could imagine somebody saying, if they just at the kind of point of combustion GHGs from natural gas use and not the full life cycle analysis of fugitive methane release from fracking and from along the pipelines, you could imagine somebody saying a strategy for Vermont to reduce its in-boundary emissions is to expand natural gas pipelines and get people off of fuel oil. I do not think that that would be a wise strategy for many reasons, but including because it would just be pushing emissions elsewhere, including the states that we would be importing that natural gas from. So I do think that, Richard, you're right, that it's possible to reduce emissions elsewhere that wouldn't show up in the Vermont inventory. I think another lens we're going to want to take is making sure we don't advance strategies that reduce our emissions in our sector-based in-boundary inventory, but are just pushing them elsewhere, not resulting in a net decrease in terms of the accounting that really matters, which is global emissions.
Thank you. I agree with you.
I have one other question. I don't see anybody else's hands up, so I'm going to go ahead, David. And can you talk a little bit more about what the report says about REC accounting? I know you mentioned it briefly with regard to what Massachusetts is doing. I think it was an explicit question that at least this I can't remember if it was in your formal scope of work, but the subcommittee had passed it along in terms of how the REC markets and how we track attributes of electricity should be counted. And I know you addressed it at least a little bit in your report.
I had another one of those carts going by, so I was holding the computer up to my ear to try to hear your question, TJ, but I think I got the gist of it. So with the REC accounting, we're part of a regional electric grid, and RECs, the renewable energy certificates, are used by the states in the region to assign the environmental attributes from renewable generation sources. And Vermont both is purchases RECs from other jurisdictions as well as sells RECs into jurisdictions. So some of the renewable energy that is generated in Vermont, the environmental credit for that is claimed in another state. And likewise, some of the environmental credit that we claim is generated in another state. Vermont has been, and Colin, please feel free to jump in. I've done the best that we can in the report to capture these things, but I recognize we may not get it all correct in the first cut. But Vermont has been using, a method to look with information from the utilities on the settlement of RECs, so a proper accounting. And I guess the first thing I should say is that RECs are they're an existing and an important policy for accounting for the environmental attributes of renewable generation, wherever that's happening. So not counting for RECs and ignoring RECs in the inventory, I do not think is not recommended. So I think RECs should be part of the inventory, and that a proper accounting of RECs, and ideally a proper accounting of RECs at the whole regional level, to make sure that the environmental attributes from solar generated in Vermont are being counted once. It's not being counted twice. It's not being counted in multiple places, that we've got the solar generation in Vermont, but it's being counted as solar generation, or the environmental attributes are being counted in another state. So Massachusetts has done an extremely complex accounting workbook that summarizes this on a state-by-state basis, on an annual basis, with all of the rec settlements, and using that as a to inform the Vermont inventory, I think looking forward would be appropriate. I think what Vermont has done so far in terms of accounting for the rec settlements based just on the Vermont's utility reporting is sufficient for now, but I think looking forward, using, participating in or using the workbook developed by Massachusetts would be a good idea. Did I capture? I'm sorry, because I didn't hear the full question, TJ. But
I think that was I think you answered the question I asked, and I just maybe it's a better thing to follow up offline. I'm not sure everybody's as interested as I am, but I'm not sure the difference between the mass effort and what the NEPOOL GIS does already, which assigns an attribute, renewable or not, to all electricity in New England, and including imports, and everybody uses it as a basis for compliance with their portfolio standards.
Yeah, they have done some things, and I'm not sure that I cannot capture the nuances of the work that they've done that goes beyond NEPOOL GIS, but they have done some of the accounting that I think is helpful on that front. So, but we should follow up offline with that. Okay. And Colin, I'd be, yeah, we can leave that for some further discussion.
Thank you. Are there any other questions on what David has presented today? From subcommittee members, I should say. The public can hang tight for another minute here. Richard.
Sorry, I have questions about things that he hasn't presented yet. We have half an hour left. David, are you going to present the domain specific items? The sector specific items?
No, this is for today. This is the findings and the recommendations as summarized in the report is what I'm presenting today. The report includes a discussion of the different individual, we categorized it under the issues and opportunities section of the report and addressed the different comments that have been included in the open letter to the Climate Council and some of the other discussions with those. So those are—
because at some point I would like to have a conversation about how we account for CO2 emissions related to burning wood and other biomass for building heat, yeah. And how that relates to the land use piece. And I really want this subcommittee to have that conversation. And I'm hoping that'll happen at our next meeting if it's not going to happen today.
I'm happy to try to address it today if time permits. But let's.
I may not be the only person who has sector-specific interests. I'm just mentioning this one because I'm interested in it.
Yeah.
I would also just
note, I'll let you determine on, I don't know for timing.
Just for purposes of time, we do have this meeting, this line scheduled and available until 4 o'clock. So if I don't think we need to hew exactly to the planned agenda. We do the other things that we need to make sure we reserve time for public comment and task lead updates. But I mean, I would defer to TJ and tracking and looking at the agenda, but I do think we have at least a little bit more time, though we should probably try to start wrapping up this portion and then identify what we need to go into further at future meetings so that we can reserve time for task lead updates and public comment.
I think addressing that at a high level, David, and maybe talking about the interaction with the carbon budget and the other portion of your work that is not included, because there's kind of this overlap of work. I think that would be helpful.
Okay.
Would you like me to put the ball in play, or do you want to do it?
Well, I saw you sent you sent an email comment, Richard, and that was very helpful. I saw that, but I'm happy to have you tee up the question more if you'd like to.
Yeah, thank you. It has been standard practice in inventories to of various kinds, national ones and various state inventories, including Vermont's inventory, to not count carbon dioxide releases from burning wood for heat. We count releases of other greenhouse gases from burning wood for heat, but not the CO2. And the rationale given for this is that the decrement in stored carbon should be accounted for in the land use, the sequestration analysis. So the sort of landscape approach to saying, well, by harvesting wood, we have reduced the amount of stored carbon by a certain amount. And that's where that should be accounted for, and we shouldn't account for it twice. I hope I'm doing justice to that argument. This is a pretty superficial way of looking at it. When wood is harvested, it can be used for lumber, it can be used for paper, it can be used as feedstock for chemical manufacturing, or it can be left in the forest, or it can be burned for heat. Oh, it can also be burned to generate electricity, and I'll leave that out for now. So if you just look at total wood harvested, that's not a good measure of how much wood was burned for heat, because you need to know what fraction of the harvested wood was burned for heat. So that's one place of intersection between my concerns and the land use piece. The other argument that has been advanced is, well, when you burn wood for heat, the wood grows back, and so really it's renewable, and so we should count it as zero. That's the sort of cartoon version of that argument. The problem with that argument is that it takes 30 to 50 or 70 years for the wood to grow back. In the meantime, the carbon dioxide is in the atmosphere doing its thing. So what I have, in some correspondence that I shared with our co-chairs and with David, I suggested that we should assign a global warming potential. That's what's called GWP bio to carbon dioxide, to wood that is burned for heat, that is somewhere in the range of 0.3. Well, that reflects the fact that you can think of the carbon dioxide generated by burning wood for heat as a short-lived greenhouse gas, or as a short-lived greenhouse gas, like methane, that it's all gone in 20 or 30 or 50 years, however long you think it takes for the replacement wood to grow. And it's been modeled, and there's a whole literature on what should be the correct value of GWP bio. But they're in the range of 0.3 to 0.5. They're not zero, and they're not one. They're somewhere in the range between 0.5. Seems to be the consensus of where that ought to be. But it depends largely on how long we think it's going to take for the biomass to regrow. If you're burning switchgrass that'll grow back in a year, then it really is immediately renewable. If you're cutting boreal forest that's going to take 100 years to grow back, then that's it's almost like it's infinite. It's never going to grow back in our lifetime. So there's, as was pointed out, there's an interaction between the carbon dioxide accounting of wood of fuels that are burned to generate heat, and this landscape-based approach. And I wanted to put this in play, and I want to hear what David has to say about it, because I know he's thought about it a lot.
Thank you, Richard. I've thought about it some. Other people have thought about it quite a lot. And it's very helpful and important that there is this, as part of the Cadmus team overall, there's a task 2, which is a carbon budget. And we're working with Jillian Galford at UVM. Jonathan Thompson from Harvard Forest is contributing as well to the analysis. Heather Darby from UVM as well. So the points that you're raising are active discussions, considerations, and guidance from Ipcc and others. And there's a little bit of, you know, I haven't called out that individual issue in the findings and recommendations, but it actually is kind of covered by, we should stay with the guidelines, which do not count biogenic CO2 in the primary inventory, but can include it as supplemental information. And that's indeed what Vermont does. We estimate CO2 emissions from biomass combustion. And we included the chart from the inventory that shows that includes biogenic CO2 emissions as well as sequestration for a net emissions analysis. That's very important and you know, for policy, for management practices, all of these different things. The GWSA targets are on gross emissions that count biogenic CO2 as zero. And so it's not, you know, our findings and recommendations are not in any way questioning the information and the importance of the types of things that you're indicating here that need to be part of Vermont's overall development of the policies, strategies, the carbon budget. Even going through now a carbon budget, the development of a carbon budget will be a major step forward. And I think, you know, potentially with more time, we would have task 1 and task 2 reports kind of all integrated as one thing. But we're you know, we worked hard with ANR and the DPS and everything to get, you know, scopes of work and deliverables that could be informative under the tight time frame. So how the carbon budget work completely integrates with the greenhouse gas inventory review. We're on parallel tracks. We're moving both of them forward right now. The carbon accounting can and should be done according to guidance in that land use sector. And the steps that Vermont's taking to improve that inventory will be really helpful along those lines.
So when we're choosing a pathway for reducing emissions related to heating buildings,
Yep.
I don't think it's correct to use zero as a value for CO2 without bringing in the corresponding reduction in stored carbon from the landscape analysis, from the land use analysis. I think that's an error in the existing comprehensive energy plan that the Department of Public Service issued in 2016. I think that's an error there. What it looks like is there was this big gap between what you could achieve by fuel switching and what needed to be, and the reductions in greenhouse gases that were needed. And it was convenient to count home heating with biomass as zero because that filled in the gap. I mean, I wasn't there. I wasn't there for the conversation. So maybe this is totally unfair. But I don't want us to do that in future. I don't want us to say, oh, this is easy. We'll replace all the fossil fuels with pellets and we'll be done. That's not the answer. Okay. And again, I'm exaggerating for effect. I understand nobody's proposing that exactly. But we need, if we're going to replace fossil fuels with pellets, we need to say, well, what is in fact the greenhouse gas impact of pellet use? And it's not zero. It's something.
Right. Yep. And I think that that's an example of an analysis that's an important part of the mitigation strategies, the sensitivity of those strategies to the emissions factors that you apply, the recognition that, as you said, not all of the carbon that comes off the landscape turns into pellets. There are other uses for it, et cetera. And that is where the analysis that the the Cadmus team under the task 2 work will be helping to inform those analyses as we go forward as well. So, but yes, your point is well taken, and we're not recommending that mitigation strategies and analyses be based on a 0 CO2 emissions for biogenic carbon, but the emissions inventory, and I know that it's somewhat unsatisfactory, but the emissions inventory method, that is the way it's accounted for.
We just need to make sure that we actively make sure that the landscape-based analysis is incorporated into the decision-making.
We'll try, yep, thank you.
Thank you, Richard, and thank you, David. I think you may have one more slide, and it'd be useful to just go over those next steps again. Oh, and you're on mute.
Sorry about that. So thank you, everybody. It's great to have people who want to be engaged on these topics and participate in. This is not our first meeting to discuss these, and really appreciate people's inputs and people's view on all of these things. What we'd like to do, recognizing this is all still trying to be on an accelerated time frame, is to provide red line edits or comments directly to EFG, as well as to CC Jane at Jane Lazarchuk at ANR by this Friday if possible. So we'd like to, have that be recommendations for edits or areas that need to be clarified. Depending on how much of that we get that we want to incorporate directly into the report, we'll try to return those revisions by, I think, as TJ said, I try to get them back on Monday next week, maybe Tuesday, depending on the level and the depth of any clarifications, revisions. And then next week, allow for, I would recommend next week, let's not plan to go over what I did today. Hopefully we've been through the findings and recommendations. Really try to focus on how the subcommittee can work with the report that we've provided and with revisions to come up with a document that represents either consensus or consensus with dissenting opinions, non-consensus positions, as recommendations for the Climate Council, and wanting to finalize that by, say, the 18th. So an accelerated time frame for comments and questions, clarifications back to us. Another discussion next week, hopefully covering kind of more where do we go from here ground than a review. I could do probably a quick review, but I don't think we'll want to spend the time to recover all of what we've done today, and then moving towards the final recommendations for the Climate Council. TJ, Jared, is that capturing your vision for this?
Yeah, thank you. And I just want to reiterate that that by Friday is for subcommittee members to provide those edits or comments to David and Jane, and the general public should use the comment portal. We'll still be reviewing those and sending those along and considering them. But
thank you.
And the other thing I just wanted to note is that next week, I think we'll get into this in a minute, but this, unlike today, I think it will not be the only agenda item. I don't think it's likely to be. We have a lot of other business as well with this committee. We're really ramping up here in the summer, so which makes it a little more challenging, but also we're getting to the real substance of it. So this is the good stuff.
Including as a preview for folks, and correct me if I'm wrong, Jane or David or TJ, but my understanding is we are provisionally planning on sharing next week the draft of the report and hearing a presentation and having a bit of discussion on the social cost of carbon report, just so folks can be ahead.
Yep, the cost of carbon and the discount rate and the social cost of carbon and the cost of carbon model review from the department. So the task 3 report that we were working on in parallel, basically with this work.
Right. Well, thank you again, David. I think please stick around if you can. We'd like to do some public comment. I think we had on the agenda a task leads update, and if it's okay and you have time, David, I'd kind of like to do that first so we can have public comment, just address everything instead of kind of going back again afterwards.
I can stand.
Great. So I actually don't have the task lead sheet in front of me, but I know that the next one, it may be ingrained into my memory. The next one on that spreadsheet underneath greenhouse gas inventory is the LEAP modeling, and we're still, SEI is still making refinements to the model. I know there was a meeting this week on the non-energy portion of the model and coordinating assumptions with EFG's work there on the carbon budget and some of the non-energy pieces. Right now, there's not a lot of data in that sector, and so there's a lot of defaults are being used in the model, and so just narrowing down and honing in on what exactly to use for assumptions and what, how to account for mitigation strategies is still being discussed. I think there's opportunity. I'm not sure there will be time next week in our agenda, but there is a mitigation pathway, and the SEI is working on incorporating now the draft policies that were presented to the Climate Council on the Monday, 2 days ago, or no, it was last week. Sorry, last Monday, and incorporating those as into the model as the mitigation pathway to see where that lands us. So I think I will stop there in terms of the LEAP modeling. One more thing is that discussions will be starting as well on the economic analysis, and so this is the part where we take the LEAP outputs and make sure they're in a form that the technical consultants can input them into the econometric models to see those second order impacts on Vermont's economy. And so some of that translation effort is going to be starting, I think, in the coming weeks. So I think that's the update there. Any questions on LEAP or modeling, I should say broadly? Hearing none, I think the next is the cross-sector strategies, and if Leslie Ann or Jay, if you guys are still on the line, then see if there's an update from one of you.
Nothing really to report for right now. We haven't had a chance to meet again since the last time, so we're good.
Can David maybe stop sharing his screen, TJ, so we can see everybody?
Oh, great. Yeah, thanks. Thank you, Julie, for that suggestion, and David. Okay, so The other piece, the other main piece, I think, is social cost of carbon. And as you just heard, there will be a report distributed soon, I believe, and ready for review for kind of a similar introduction this week. And I'm sorry, a similar introduction to that report coming next week as to what we had to the greenhouse gas inventory this week. The other piece is the I know my memory is not serving me well. I think the last task item is the data collection or data collection, reporting on data, and creating a measurement and tracking system. And I guess Leslie, and I'm going to turn to you again and see if there's anything new to report from the last meeting. I know you had made some progress last time, so.
Right, and still nothing left to actually do a report out, so we're good on that.
Okay. Great. Are there any other updates on other items of interest across the council?
I'll just note, because it's so relevant to the GHG inventory and the LEAP modeling and pathways, that yesterday EAN hosted a lunch and learn with a great presentation from our data manager, May Butler, presenting our emissions reduction pathways analysis. The slides, a static version of the model, the recording, and the white paper that accompany that will all be posted on our website later this week. So once that's ready, I'll share it around with the committee. And thank you for some of you who were able to attend.
Great, thanks, Jared.
And I'd also just really quickly on the data gaps side, we have had two very impressive summer interns working with EAN this summer, looking at some of the energy equity data gaps and recommendations specifically with regard to the thermal and transportation sectors. And they will be presenting their resulting research next Thursday, August 12th from noon to 1. If folks want information on that, they can find it on the EAN website or in our latest newsletter if you're on our list. But I think that's another, both of them, I think, advance the ball and share new data and analysis, especially with regard to energy sector, and have recommendations for addressing identified data gaps as it regards to equity and mapping. And they've done some really good work. So if folks are able to join for that, I think you may find it of interest. I'll put the link in the chat as well.
Thank you, Jared.
Unless there are other updates, please interrupt or raise your hand if there are, but I think we're probably ready to move to public comment. And I guess, as usual, would just ask members of the public to raise your hand, and then we'll recognize you. I see George. George, please feel free to start your video and unmute.
Hi. Very interesting presentation. Since I imagine there are others who would like to make comments, I'll try to keep my remarks as brief as possible. I've been making notes as I went through the presentation. So the primary inventory method is in a way deficient in the sense that it does not have a concept of version control and migration to improved data that is informed by current science. And frankly, there's no way really to fix that. There's a lot of regulatory inertia to maintain that status quo and use it for the purposes that have been established long ago. That doesn't necessarily commit the Vermont Climate Council to be in strict lockstep allegiance to it as the only tool. In fact, it may not even be the primary tool. It should be maybe a tool that's set aside because its usefulness in the context of what the Climate Council has to do is marginal compared to that could be achieved by having a second inventory, a greenhouse gas life cycle accounting inventory that explicitly has version control in it, recognizes that data going into that inventory is fuzzy and has to have improvements as time goes on and we understand better what's going on. That this inventory will in fact be the one that sets the parameters in our leak modeling. So the SEP and the Climate Council's work at this SEI are using the same best available data as opposed to the limitations of that are inherent to the in-state territorial model. And so what I'm basically saying in short is that we should have a second public-facing greenhouse gas life cycle accounting inventory. That is the model of the Vermont Climate Council. That is the basis for all modeling done by the Climate Council, and is in fact in the public-facing arena the tool that one would refer to measure progress by the Climate Council from here going forward, irrespective of what it was, say, in 1990 or any other previous year. I'll say the obvious. Really, from here on out, it's all about how we do better and get our emissions down to near zero by 2050. And to look retrospectively at other things from a statutory perspective is, I guess, a nice to have, but it's not essential. It's really, we are checkpointing it today using the best available data, refining that data as we improve it, and having a version control on it. So every data parameter has to have a date in which it was actually adopted and then as needed, refined and improved. And we've improved the inventory as we discover more. This is common practice in the sciences. I'll give you an example from my own professional experience. In internet standards arena, some of the early security standards did not have a concept of version control. And when a cryptographic algorithm failed because someone did cryptography and broke the algorithm, there were computers out there who were vulnerable because the algorithm was no longer secure. The consequence was the standard had to be abandoned and superseded with a new one that did have an ability to do what we call algorithm agility, which was to move to a new cryptographic algorithm and negotiate it at the time you're conversing with this remote party over the internet and saying, here's the best available algorithm that's secure that we both can agree to use. Now, mapping it into the current context, I think what you have to recognize is that the best available data depends on when you look. And we kind of have to embrace a certain amount of uncertainty because of that. Local to the work ahead, I've done some work recently in regards to both biomass at the renewable energy standard rule that was proposed for rulemaking, and I placed public comments in that. I hope your committee has had a copy of that available to them. It would help you inform your discussions about the biomass life cycle. With respect to the ISO New England life cycle emissions for all varieties of electricity, I've done work in that arena as well. And given the current drift of the conversation today, I think it would be important to place that in front of this committee as early as possible, simply because that work is kind of a cornerstone for how you would measure out of state emissions. If you've done that for all the electric generation sources in New England, you have at least a good handle on starting this whole process for doing a life cycle accounting inventory for the Climate Council. All right, that's that. Thank you.
Thank you, George. Next, I see Mark Whitworth. Your hand is up, please.
Yeah, thanks, Jared. And thanks, David, for the presentation. It was very good. But my comments relate mostly to comments that were made in the audio stream and in the chat during the presentation. And Jared hit the nail on when he said it might be possible for us to meet all of the goals of the Global Warming Solutions Act and make things worse. And I think that it's not only possible, I think it's likely. And that's because the Global Warming Solutions Act values emissions reduction more than it values environmental protection, more than it values adaptation and resilience, even though the law talks about all of those things. And that's not the fault of anybody here. That's the way the sausage came out when they were making it. I think Richard identified the problem of consumption and said that it is probably not we should not expect the climate plan to address consumption. But the fact is, there are too many of us. We consume too much stuff. We're wasteful. We travel too much, and we're way too eager to degrade the environment. And I don't know, if I were on the council, how I would deal with that. Massachusetts is a cautionary tale. They have a Global Warming Solutions Act, and in order to meet the goals that it mandates, they are constructing a tremendously damaging transmission line from Hydro-Quebec to Massachusetts that runs through the Great Northern Forest, fragmenting it in Maine. Ken Jones made a comment in the chat about accounting, not focusing on the Vermont's dairy industry because most of our dairy products are exported. And one of my fears is that the climate plan is going to include policies that are very business unfriendly. Driving business out of Vermont, a few miles down the road here is a plant that makes electronic components. They have a sister plant in Ohio. They could easily decide that they're going to pick up their Vermont operation and move it to Ohio, where the emissions associated with their production goes up. So not only do we lose that economic opportunity here, but we actually make things worse. The emissions associated with the production of those materials goes up, and we don't stop buying them. We're still buying them. So I have become increasingly agitated over the course of this meeting, ever since Richard noted that we're probably not going to recommend that people cut back on their consumption. But if we don't, we're not solving our real problems. Thanks.
Thank you for your comment, Mark. Is there anyone else, member of the public, who'd like to comment? See Steve Crowley's hand. Steve, please go ahead.
Hi, thanks. This has been a great discussion today. I'm really glad to hear the subcommittee dive into this and look forward to hearing more. One thing that I want to raise regarding the concept of dual inventories is, and I'm not sure how to interpret everything I heard today, but one of the core concepts of the Global Warming Solutions Act is to line up with the Paris goals, to recognize the science and to reduce emissions, and it's kind of a new thing. I mean, our old inventory, our old policies were based on something we referred to as renewability, which is a concept that evolved over the years, and it isn't necessarily the same as reducing greenhouse gases. So it seems essential to me to be shifting a few things in order to be able to do this new task. So that's one aspect of things. think it's easy to say, well, we've been doing things for a certain amount of time, so we should keep doing them that way. But I think the point of this is that we can't keep doing things the same old way. My second quick point would be that another core concept of the Act is accountability. And I'm not sure how accountability under the Global Warming Solutions Act lines up with the two types of inventory. But I think that the type of inventory that we probably need to keep doing, which is the one we use to report back to EPA, Ipcc, the thing that can't double count and all that, I think that's got to still happen. But I don't think that lines up with accountability under the Global Warming Solutions Act. I think that the one that involves, as you discussed, the energy outside of the state, the emissions from energy outside of the state, is the one that lines up with the law. So I think you kind of have to do both. And when many of you have been using phrases like an analytical tool, a supplemental analysis tool, and I'm not sure how that fits in to that accountability framework. That is, to me, when I hear a supplemental tool, I don't think that kind of planning tool really fits into the accountability standards that are called for in the Act. I don't know if there are probably a lot of ways to think about that, but a lot of the language sounds fine, but the bottom line language is, I believe, maybe I'm a little cynical about this, but I think that the accountability framework, the specific legal accountability framework, is what's actually going to happen in the real world. All the rest is going to be sitting on shelves. So I hope that you folks will think about, what are we really going to be using for accountability, and leading into things like, the PUC decisions and long-term planning for utilities and all the rest. So thank you.
Thank you, Steve. I see that Mark and George's hands are still up. I'm going to assume those are old hands unless they speak up and say they want to make an additional comment. Otherwise, is there anyone else who has not had the chance to speak who'd like the opportunity to make a comment? Okay. Then I think the last part of our agenda is kind of wrap up and next steps. So just a reminder that our next subcommittee meeting is next Wednesday, August 11th from 1:30 to 4 o'clock, as usual. TJ and Jane and I will get together with Catherine to plan out the agenda later this week. If there are specific questions or comments or suggestions you have as we begin doing that, please email TJ or I. But I think it's safe to assume that there will be some additional opportunities to follow up on the process we've outlined for the report on the greenhouse gas inventory, and we'll also begin looking at the social cost of carbon and related tasks reports, hearing back from David and all next week. TJ, Jane, anything that I may have missed that is worth making sure to say before we conclude the meeting?
I don't think so. I always like to say thank you to the members of the public and for spending the time with us and providing your valuable feedback, and thank you, David, for the presentation. That was really helpful framing for us all to think about until we meet again next week.
Yeah. Thank you again, David, for a great presentation, and your whole team for your really impressive and important work. And thanks for everybody for I think the comments and questions clear that people are very interested in paying close attention, both from the subcommittee members and from, we're really lucky to have the attention and expertise of members of the public complementing that. So thank you, everyone. And
Great.
enjoy.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks. Have a good afternoon.